The first time I heard the laughter, I thought it was just feedback, a glitch from the cheap baby monitor sitting on my nightstand. My daughter had been asleep for hours, her soft breathing the only comfort in the empty house. But the sound that came through the speaker wasn't her cooing. It was deeper, older, and laughing with her. I remember freezing, my hand halfway to the volume knob. The laughter faded into static, and for a moment, I told myself I'd imagined it. New mother nerves, exhaustion, the usual explanations that keep you sane when things don't make sense. But then, through the crackle, came a voice. It was my own. "Shish, Mommy's here." The words were soft, familiar, spoken in the same tone I used to calm her after a nightmare. I felt the blood drain from my face. I wasn't speaking. I was sitting there, wide awake, listening to myself whisper to my child from a room I hadn't entered. And then, through the faint hum of static, my baby began to laugh again. It began on a Wednesday night, the kind of night where silence feels heavier than usual, pressing against the walls and filling every room. She had just put her daughter, Emma, to bed after a long evening of feeding, changing, and soothing soft cries that came and went with no rhythm. The house was old, too old perhaps, with wooden floors that sighed under each step and pipes that moaned whenever the temperature dropped. She'd grown used to those sounds over the past few months, convincing herself that old homes had their own way of breathing. When the baby monitor crackled to life, she thought it was just another quirk of the house. At first, there was only static, that familiar soft hiss that had become background noise since Emma's birth. But then, through the white noise, came something faint, a high, delighted giggle, light and airy, like a bubble floating through the air. Her lips curved into a smile automatically. It was Emma's laugh, one of those rare, innocent sounds that made every sleepless night worth it. But as she looked at the clock, a thin line of confusion crept through her mind. It was nearly 1:47 a.m. Emma should have been fast asleep. The laugh came again, clearer this time, followed by the soft rhythm of babbling, those playful noises babies make when they're exploring their voice. She leaned closer to the monitor, expecting to see Emma moving around in her crib, but the video feed showed something still. The faint green hue of the night vision displayed her baby lying motionless, her small chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of deep sleep. Yet the sounds continued, distinct and joyful, echoing faintly as though the baby were awake and playing. A strange chill prickled at the back of her neck. She turned the volume down, then up again, testing to see if maybe the device was picking up interference from another household. But they lived on the edge of town, surrounded by fields and silence. There were no nearby signals to cross, no other monitors to confuse it with. The only sound should have been her daughter breathing softly. She whispered her baby's name under her breath, almost instinctively, though she knew Emma couldn't hear her from the next room. For a moment, the laughter stopped, as if whatever was on the other end had paused to listen. Then came another giggle, fainter, slower, and somehow, wrong. It didn't sound like Emma anymore. There was a rhythm to it, a deliberate pattern, almost as if someone were pretending to mimic a child. She stared at the monitor, the grainy image of the sleeping baby unmoving, her pulse quickening with every passing second as the laughter grew softer, until it melted back into static, leaving her with a feeling that she hadn't been alone in the silence at all. The next few nights passed in uneasy quiet, the kind that feels too deliberate, as though the house itself was holding its breath. She tried to convince herself the laughter had been a dream born of exhaustion, but something deep inside her kept replaying that sound, that eerie joy echoing from a room she hadn't entered. Then, one night, as rain tapped lightly against the windows, she heard it again, the faint hum of static followed by the soft coo of her daughter. She froze halfway through folding laundry, the monitor light glowing a dull green in the corner. At first, the babble was ordinary, the kind of sleepy chatter Emma sometimes made before drifting off completely. But then, cutting through the gentle rhythm of baby sounds, came a whisper so low she thought her mind had conjured it. Emma. Her name. Spoken in a tone of tenderness. Familiar. The kind of voice a mother would use to soothe her child. Only she hadn't spoken. The monitor was on the dresser, the transmitter in the nursery, she was nowhere near it. Her throat tightened as she stared at the device, watching the tiny speaker pulse with each sound that came through. The whisper came again, clearer this time, floating through the static with an uncanny precision that made her skin crawl. Shush, it's okay. "Mommy's here." Her breath caught. It was her voice. Her exact voice, every inflection, every softness in tone. She felt her knees weaken as her mind tried to process the impossible. She looked toward the hallway that led to the nursery, dark except for the faint light seeping from under the door. For a few seconds, she couldn't move. The thought of entering that room, of seeing what might be standing over her child, rooted her in place. Then Emma began to whimper, a small, confused sound that twisted into a cry. The instinct to protect took over, and she ran, flinging open the nursery door. The room was just as she'd left it, the curtains drawn, the mobile above the crib turning slowly in the draft from the window. Emma was lying still, tears clinging to her cheeks, her eyes darting toward the corner near the monitor camera. She scooped her up, whispering words of comfort, but her voice trembled when she realized the monitor speaker on the wall was still alive with faint breathing. It wasn't the sound of a baby. It was steady, deliberate, like someone standing too close to the microphone, exhaling into it softly. She turned it off, unplugged it, and held her daughter tight against her chest, her heart racing as she stared at the silent crib. Even without the monitor, she swore she could still hear it, her own voice whispering her daughter's name in the dark. The night the monitor flickered was the first time she truly understood that something inside her home was wrong. She had begun sleeping with the device muted, its eerie noises too much for her to bear, but that night a faint electrical hum pulled her awake. The room was dim, lit only by the dull glow of the monitor's screen. It shouldn't have been on, she'd unplugged it earlier that evening. Yet there it was, buzzing faintly, its light pulsing like a heartbeat. At first, she thought she was dreaming, caught between sleep and waking, but the soft whir of static coming through its speaker was real. She reached over with trembling hands and tapped the power button. Nothing. The image on the screen shimmered, then cleared. The nursery appeared, bathed in that ghostly green tint from the infrared camera. Her baby was asleep, motionless beneath the blankets. For a moment, relief steadied her shaking breath until she noticed movement on the right side of the frame. A shape leaned over the crib. The outline was unmistakable, a woman, her posture tender, her hair falling over her shoulder as she bent close. For several seconds, she simply stared, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. Then the figure moved slightly, enough for the faint light to reveal her face. It was her. Not someone who looked like her, not a vague resemblance, but her, the exact same features, the same tired eyes, the same loose braid she had tied her hair into before bed. The woman on the screen was humming softly, her lips barely moving, the same lullaby she used to sing when Emma was newborn, a tune she hadn't sung in months. Her first instinct was to rush to the nursery, but her body refused to move. Her mind flooded with questions that had no reasonable answers. How could she be in two places at once? Was it a malfunction, some strange mirror effect from the infrared feed? She blinked hard, hoping the figure would disappear when she opened her eyes again, but it remained there, gently stroking the air above her daughter's head. Then, as though sensing her gaze, the reflection turned. Slowly, deliberately, the figure's head lifted, eyes locking with the camera lens. The screen distorted, lines rippling across the image, but for a fraction of a second, she saw it smile, not a warm, motherly smile, but one that seemed to stretch too far, too aware. The monitor hissed, the picture tearing into static, and the sound that came through was a faint, mocking echo of her own voice whispering the same lullaby back to her, note for note, as if daring her to come closer. She couldn't bring herself to use the monitor again after that night. It sat unplugged on the dresser, its plastic casing gathering a thin film of dust, the lens pointed uselessly toward the ceiling. For days, she tried to rationalize what she had seen: a malfunction, a power surge, a dream brought on by sleeplessness, but no explanation seemed to fit. The image of that figure, identical to her in every detail, haunted her whenever she closed her eyes. Even Emma seemed unsettled. The baby, once so easy to soothe, now woke screaming at odd hours, staring toward the corner of the room where the monitor had once stood. There were moments when the air in the nursery felt heavier, charged with something unseen, and every instinct inside her told her not to stay there too long after dark. One evening, a storm rolled through. The rain beat hard against the windows, and thunder rumbled low across the horizon. She was rocking Emma in her arms, humming softly, when a faint melody drifted through the house, a quiet tune, so familiar that her voice faltered. It was the lullaby. The same haunting song she'd seen the other version of herself humming through the monitor. The sound was coming from the nursery. She froze, her breath catching in her throat, every muscle locking in place. The monitor was still unplugged. The room beyond the hallway was dark. Yet the song continued, low and deliberate, as though someone were standing beside the crib again. Her pulse hammered in her ears as she laid Emma down in her cot, whispering to her not to cry, and stepped slowly toward the nursery. Each footfall seemed to echo louder than it should have, swallowed by the quiet between thunderclaps. When she reached the doorway, she paused, hand trembling against the frame. The lullaby stopped. For a second, the only sound was her breathing, quick and shallow. Then, softly, unmistakably, came a second voice. Not singing, whispering. Two voices, overlapping. One was her own, soft and familiar, the tone she used to comfort her daughter. The other was lower, raspier, like a version of her voice played through broken glass. Her stomach twisted as she reached for the light switch, flipping it on in one quick motion. The bulb flickered weakly, revealing an empty room. The crib was still, the curtains swaying gently in the draft. But the sound hadn't stopped completely, it had retreated, lingering faintly beneath the hum of the storm. Two voices still whispering, somewhere just beyond the walls, repeating the same phrase over and over again. Shush, Mommy's here. Her voice, and something else pretending to be it, overlapping perfectly, until she could no longer tell which one was truly hers. Days turned into weeks, and though the house appeared calm again, she couldn't shake the sense that she was being watched. The lullaby no longer echoed through the halls, and the whispers had quieted, yet there was a stillness now that felt worse than noise. The monitor remained unplugged, sealed away in a box in the attic, but that didn't matter. Every time she walked past a mirror or glanced at her reflection in a window, something seemed just slightly off, her movements delayed by a fraction of a second, her expression not quite matching her thoughts. Sometimes, when she was holding Emma, she'd catch sight of herself reflected in the glass of a picture frame, and for the briefest instant, her reflection's eyes weren't on her, they were fixed on the baby. She told herself it was exhaustion, the toll of too many sleepless nights, the shadows of anxiety stretching into her waking hours. But deep down, she knew the truth had never left that nursery. It was still there, waiting. One night, desperate for clarity, she went through the memory card in her old home camera, the one she used to record Emma's first months. She hadn't watched those videos since everything began. The first few clips were normal, soft giggles, her own tired laughter, the gentle creak of the rocking chair. But in one video, a recording from a few weeks before the first incident, something caught her attention. She was sitting on the nursery floor, playing with Emma, when the mirror on the opposite wall came into focus. In the reflection, she could see herself and the baby, but there was a third figure, standing behind her. It wasn't clearly defined, more like a shadow shaped into a person, its head tilted, its outline pulsing faintly with each flicker of light from the mobile. She paused the footage, her hands trembling, staring at the faint outline that seemed to lean closer toward the crib. She scrolled through the other videos, her pulse quickening as she realized the shadow appeared in nearly all of them, sometimes faint, sometimes sharper, always positioned just near Emma's bed. And then came the last video, recorded days before the night she'd seen the figure on the monitor. It began like the others, her humming softly, Emma cooing, but halfway through, the camera seemed to jolt slightly, as if someone had nudged it. The frame shifted, capturing the mirror directly. There she was, sitting on the floor. But in the reflection, her mirrored self wasn't sitting. It was standing, one hand resting on the crib rail, watching her. The reflection smiled faintly before the recording cut to black, the sound of a familiar lullaby echoing faintly in the final seconds, sung in a voice that was hers but came from somewhere else entirely. The nights after that discovery felt different, colder, as if the walls themselves were breathing in sync with her unease. Sleep became impossible. Every creak of the floorboards, every hum of the refrigerator seemed amplified, alive with intention. She kept Emma close, refusing to leave her alone in the nursery anymore. The reflection from the videos haunted her, playing in her mind over and over again, that small, knowing smile frozen behind the glass. Sometimes, while feeding Emma in the dim glow of the hallway light, she'd glance toward the darkened nursery and swear she saw a faint shimmer in the mirror, as though someone had brushed their hand across its surface from the inside. She tried to cover it with a blanket once, but by morning the cloth had fallen, lying crumpled on the floor beneath the mirror. It was subtle at first, the house simply felt different, but soon the signs became undeniable. One evening, after Emma had drifted to sleep in her arms, she heard it again, that same lullaby, faint and sweet, seeping through the air like a memory. It wasn't coming from the nursery this time. It was coming from the living room, from the television that she hadn't turned on in days. The screen was dark, but the melody poured from its speakers in the exact rhythm of her own humming. She stood frozen at the threshold, the baby's warmth pressed against her chest, her mind screaming to run but her feet refusing to move. The song faded, replaced by static, then, through the crackle, came a whisper. It was her voice, distorted but unmistakably hers, repeating the same phrase she had once said to calm her daughter, "Don't cry, Mommy's here." The words twisted in tone with each repetition until they sounded almost mocking, the sweetness warped into something that felt too close, too human. In a moment of desperate courage, she unplugged the television and fled to her bedroom, slamming the door shut behind her. But the sound didn't stop. It echoed faintly through the baby monitor still packed away in the attic, as if the device had found its way back to life on its own. A thin line of static filled the house, followed by a second voice layered beneath hers, low, hollow, and wrong. Emma began to stir, small cries breaking the suffocating quiet. She whispered, trying to soothe her, but the words caught in her throat as she heard the whisper coming again, perfectly overlapping her own. It was as if the voice knew what she would say before she spoke. She turned toward the mirror beside the bed, and there, faintly visible in the darkness, was her reflection holding Emma, but the reflection was smiling, even though she was not. The mirror became the center of her dread, the silent witness to something she could no longer deny. It stood there, tall and old, framed in dark wood that had come with the house when they moved in. She had never paid much attention to it before, it had seemed just another antique left behind by the previous owners, but now it felt alive, aware, like it was waiting. Every time she passed it, she felt her reflection watching her a moment too long after she'd moved away. Sometimes she'd glance quickly, hoping to catch it wrong, to prove to herself that her mind was simply unraveling under exhaustion, but there were moments when she saw her reflection blink a second too late or turn its head slightly after she'd already looked away. She began to avoid mirrors altogether, covering the one in the nursery first, then the one in the hallway, then finally her own. But no matter how many she hid, she always felt its presence, like the reflection was no longer bound to a single surface, but following her from one pane of glass to the next. It was around this time that Emma began waking at the same hour each night. 3:07. Always the same minute. The baby's cries were sharp, terrified, unlike her usual restless sounds. When she rushed to the crib, she'd find Emma staring toward the mirror, her tiny hands clenched tightly around her blanket. The first few times, she thought nothing of it, assuming nightmares or shadows from the window, but one night, as she bent to lift her daughter, she noticed movement in the mirror. It wasn't her own. In the dim glow of the nightlight, her reflection was still crouched beside the crib even after she had already straightened up. Her stomach dropped as the mirrored version of herself slowly lifted its face, a hollow smile spreading across its features before it began to hum that same, cursed lullaby. The sound didn't come from the air, it came from inside the glass, vibrating faintly like the whisper of something trapped but awake. She stumbled back, clutching Emma to her chest, her breath shaking as she tried to tear her eyes away. The reflection's lips moved again, forming words she couldn't hear but somehow understood. "Give her to me." The words weren't spoken aloud, but they settled in her mind with chilling clarity. She turned and fled the room, slamming the door behind her, the sound of the mirror's faint rattle echoing down the hallway. But even as she held her daughter tight, she could feel it somewhere behind that glass, her reflection was still watching, waiting for another chance to take her place. The decision to leave the house came too late. For days she had ignored the signs, telling herself that if she just stayed calm and avoided the mirrors, everything would stop. But the house had grown restless. Every reflection, even the smallest one, a spoon, a window, the black surface of her phone screen, seemed to shimmer with something lurking beneath. She had begun keeping the lights on at all hours, yet it didn't help. Shadows had taken on shape, and sometimes, she would catch sight of herself standing somewhere she wasn't, half seen at the edge of glass. Emma had grown silent too. The baby no longer cried at night, no longer laughed. She simply stared, her wide eyes fixed on the dark corners of rooms, as if listening to something her mother could not hear. There were nights when she'd wake to the sound of two people breathing in the room, hers and another, faint but synchronized, as though something unseen was sleeping beside her. The final night began like any other: rain, wind, and that oppressive quiet that wrapped around the house like a second skin. She was packing a small bag, ready to leave before dawn, when a sound drifted from the nursery. It wasn't crying. It was humming. The lullaby again, slower this time, drawn out, the notes trembling like a record played backward. Her chest tightened. The nursery door stood slightly ajar, and through the crack she could see a faint, flickering light, soft and silvery, pulsing like the reflection of candle flame on water. Her instinct screamed at her to turn back, to run, but the sound of the lullaby was mixed now with something else, her daughter's voice. A soft coo, a quiet laugh. She pushed the door open, her heart thundering as she stepped inside. The mirror she had covered days ago stood uncovered, the blanket she'd taped across it crumpled on the floor. In its surface, the reflection of the room glowed dimly, but there was something wrong. Her reflection was there, yes, but she wasn't holding Emma. The mirrored version of herself was standing closer to the glass, head tilted, smiling that too wide smile. In her arms, she held the baby, who giggled softly, staring up with glassy eyes. The air in the room turned cold enough to sting her skin. She reached forward instinctively, desperate to pull Emma away from whatever this was, but the reflection's smile only deepened as a pale hand pressed against the inside of the glass, matching her movement perfectly. And then, as thunder rolled through the house, the baby in her arms began to fade from her grasp, replaced by the hollow sound of laughter coming from somewhere behind the mirror. The moment the laughter began, everything in the house seemed to shift. It wasn't the sweet, innocent giggle she had come to know, it was layered, echoing, as if it were coming from several mouths at once, weaving through the air like smoke. She stumbled back from the mirror, her pulse thundering in her ears, clutching the empty blanket where Emma had just been. The reflection still stood there, smiling faintly, the baby resting peacefully in its arms, untouched by the storm raging beyond the walls. Her throat tightened with a sound that wasn't quite a scream. It was too broken, too hollow to carry that kind of strength. She pounded on the glass, desperate to shatter it, to pull her daughter back, but the mirror remained unyielding. Each strike sent ripples through the reflection like water, distorting her image, warping it into grotesque versions of herself, faces stretching, eyes widening, mouths opening in silent laughter. The reflection holding Emma began to hum again, the same melody that had haunted the house for weeks, but now, beneath the tune, she could hear words. Now she's safe. Now she's mine. Her mind reeled, unable to comprehend whether she was hearing the voice aloud or inside her own head. The air grew thicker, heavier, and for the first time, she noticed the faint shape of hands pressing against the inside of the mirror, not one pair, but several. Tiny hands, like Emma's, but there were others too, larger, older, pressing and dragging along the glass as if something inside wanted out. The surface began to fog over, blurring the reflection until all she could see were faint outlines. She turned away, gasping for air, searching for something, anything that could break the mirror. Her gaze landed on the heavy wooden chair in the corner. She grabbed it, her muscles trembling, and hurled it toward the glass. The impact sent a crack spreading across the surface like lightning, and for the briefest instant, she saw the reflection's smile falter. Then the mirror shattered. The sound was deafening, shards scattering across the floor like rain. But the silence that followed was worse. The reflection was gone, the humming stopped, and the room fell still. She dropped to her knees, sifting through the broken pieces, calling her daughter's name again and again, her voice raw and trembling. But only one sound answered, a faint giggle, distant and muffled, coming not from the mirror anymore, but from the walls around her, as if the house itself had swallowed her child and was now laughing quietly in her place. The house was silent for days after the mirror shattered, but it wasn't the peaceful kind of silence, it was heavy, watching, full of something unseen that lingered just beyond her senses. The laughter had stopped, yet she could still feel it vibrating faintly in the walls, like an echo trapped in the wood. She barely slept, wandering through rooms that now felt foreign, carrying the baby blanket she had found tangled in the shards of glass. It was cold to the touch, damp with something that wasn't quite water. She called for Emma until her voice broke, until the sound of her own cries became unbearable. But every time she reached for a doorknob, a drawer, or a reflective surface, her own image seemed to twitch, lagging behind like a delayed recording. Once, when she walked past the dark window, she caught sight of her reflection smiling again, though her own lips were still. The nights grew longer, and with them came whispers that slipped through the quiet, soft, rhythmic, like breathing just behind her ear. Sometimes they formed words, fragments of lullabies, sometimes just a faint humming that carried through the air vents. She began covering every surface that could reflect, every trace of glass or polished metal. The house became darker, shrouded in fabric and shadow, but the presence remained. It wasn't until she found the old video camera again that she realized she could no longer escape it. It had turned itself on, the red light blinking steadily even though the battery had long since died. The small screen flickered to life as she picked it up, and the image that filled it froze her blood. It showed her nursery, intact, untouched, bathed in that eerie green tint from the night vision. The crib was there, the mobile turning slowly above it. And there was Emma, sleeping peacefully, her tiny chest rising and falling. For one fragile heartbeat, hope surged through her, until she realized the woman standing beside the crib wasn't her. The figure's hair was darker, the edges of its face too smooth, its movements too slow. When it turned toward the camera, its eyes caught the light and glowed faintly, reflecting something that wasn't human. The sound from the camera's speaker filled the room, that same familiar lullaby twisting into static. Then the figure in the video raised its hand and waved, slowly, almost tenderly. On instinct, she stepped back and in the darkened window beside her, the same hand lifted in perfect unison, waving back from her reflection. Eve, the realization that her reflection was moving on its own shattered whatever thin barrier of sanity she had left. The image in the window smiled at her, a perfect imitation, yet there was something hollow in its expression, something too deliberate, too aware. She stumbled backward, the video camera slipping from her grasp and crashing onto the floor, the screen cracking but still flickering with the distorted nursery feed. The figure inside the reflection tilted its head, mirroring her every motion with a fraction of delay, as if mocking her fear. The air around her grew colder, so cold that her breath came out in faint clouds. For a moment she thought she heard Emma's giggle again, faint and sweet, echoing from somewhere behind the walls, but it was quickly swallowed by a low hum that vibrated deep in the house's bones. She turned off every light, desperate to make it stop, but darkness only seemed to give it strength. In the blackness, the reflections didn't vanish, they multiplied. Every shadowed surface shimmered faintly, showing her faces upon faces, each one a warped version of her own. They whispered softly, words she couldn't quite make out, but she felt them pressing against her mind, crawling beneath her thoughts. Somewhere among the whispers came that same voice, hers yet not hers, saying gently, "You can't take her back. She's home now." The sound came from all directions, and as it spoke, the walls began to pulse faintly, as though the house itself were breathing. She stumbled into the nursery, the only room still faintly lit by the cracked camera screen. The mirror was gone, yet its absence felt worse than its presence. On the floor where it had stood lay the fragments, scattered like pieces of black ice. In their broken surfaces, tiny reflections blinked back at her, hundreds of eyes, watching. In the largest shard, she saw Emma again, reaching up from somewhere far beyond the glass, her tiny hand pressing against the surface. A choked sob tore from her throat as she reached toward it, fingertips brushing the edge of the shard, slicing her skin open. Blood smeared across the surface, and the reflection rippled like disturbed water. For an instant, she felt something pull, soft but insistent, from the other side, as though something was reaching for her too. The pull grew stronger, dragging her forward until her knees hit the floor. The air crackled with a sound that wasn't quite wind, wasn't quite whispering. And just before the shard slipped from her trembling hands, she heard Emma's voice, faint and distant, calling her. But the word she said wasn't Mommy. It was her own name, spoken in a voice that was no longer innocent, no longer a child's. The moment Emma's voice spoke her name, the world seemed to tilt, the air collapsing around her like something had been unsealed. The shard trembled in her hand, the blood on its edge spreading slowly across the glass as if drawn toward an unseen gravity. She couldn't move. The reflection staring back at her was no longer fractured, it was whole, alive, and smiling faintly from the other side. The nursery around her flickered, its colors dimming until everything looked washed out, drained of warmth. Only the reflection seemed vivid, bright, as though the light in the room had shifted into that other place. The figure inside the shard, her reflection, bent slightly, lifting Emma higher, and for the first time she noticed that the baby wasn't smiling. Emma's eyes were wide, glassy, and still. The reflection cradled her as if protecting something fragile, whispering words that didn't match the movement of its lips. She strained to hear, and the world around her seemed to fade until only the whisper remained. "You left her too long," it said, its voice an echo of her own, warped by something ancient. "She's mine now." The shard pulsed in her hand, the glass softening beneath her fingers like warm wax. From deep within the reflection, something began to move, shadows unfurling like smoke, spreading beyond the edges of the frame. They reached for her, curling around her arms and wrists, cold and electric. She screamed, but the sound didn't leave her throat. It was as if her voice had been swallowed whole, absorbed by the reflection that now stood taller, straighter, almost stepping through the glass. The air thickened with static, the faint hum of the baby monitor suddenly alive again somewhere in the distance, playing the lullaby through the house. Every note was distorted, broken, yet still horribly familiar. Her vision blurred as the shard vibrated violently, light bleeding from its cracks. The reflection's smile grew wider, splitting into something inhuman. Then, without warning, the glass shattered in her hand, scattering fragments across the floor. Pain seared through her palm, but she barely noticed. The nursery was silent again. The camera on the floor had gone dark. Everything was still. She turned toward the crib, her heart pounding, whispering Emma's name one last time. A faint sound answered from the shadows, a giggle, distant but growing louder. And then she saw movement in the crib. A small hand, pale and trembling, rose slowly into view, followed by another, but the thing that lifted itself over the edge wasn't her daughter. It was smaller, thinner, its face half-formed, as if mold from her own reflection. Its lips parted in a grin, and in her own voice it whispered softly, "Shish, Mommy's here." The house stood silent for days after that night, its walls heavy with an almost human stillness, as though it too had witnessed something it could never forget. The police had come and gone, murmuring to one another in the dim light of the nursery, their words hushed, their eyes averted from the crib. They found no trace of Emma, no footprints, no fingerprints, nothing but the faint imprint of her small hand pressed into the wooden frame, as if she had reached out before vanishing. The baby monitor had melted into the carpet, a warped, blackened mass that still gave off the faint smell of burnt plastic. Every attempt to explain what had happened unraveled into confusion, into silence. She told them the truth, that she had seen her reflection come alive, that something had stepped out of the glass, but they only looked at her with pity. They said grief can play tricks on the mind, that exhaustion can create ghosts out of guilt. They never stepped foot in the house again. Nights grew longer after that. She stopped sleeping, afraid of what she might hear if she closed her eyes. Sometimes she thought she heard Emma's laughter from inside the walls, muffled, far away, as though her child was trapped in another room that didn't exist. The mirrors became her greatest enemy, each one seemed to flicker when she passed, catching glimpses of movement she couldn't explain. Once, she caught sight of herself standing still when she was in motion, her reflection delayed by a second too long. It watched her leave, smiling faintly, as though waiting for the right moment to step through again. She covered every mirror in the house after that, even the dark panes of the windows, afraid that the night outside might look back at her with her own eyes. But it didn't help. The reflection found her anyway, in the kettle, in the sheen of the bathroom tiles, in the faint gleam of her phone screen when it caught the light just right. And each time it appeared, it was clearer, closer, its lips always moving, whispering the same words she had heard through the baby monitor. One evening, she awoke to find the coverings on every mirror gone. The fabric lay in heaps on the floor, as if someone had carefully removed them while she slept. The house was cold, impossibly quiet. In the faint moonlight, she saw her reflection standing not in the glass, but behind her, no longer bound, no longer waiting. Its hand rested gently on her shoulder, its voice warm and familiar as it leaned close to her ear, whispering, You left her alone too long." The voice behind her was calm, almost tender, but it carried a weight that froze her blood. She didn't turn right away. Every instinct in her body screamed that if she looked, if she acknowledged what stood there, something irreversible would happen. The air around her felt dense, heavy with static, as though the entire room had been waiting for this exact moment to exhale. The reflection's hand pressed more firmly against her shoulder, not a ghostly chill, but solid, warm skin that pulsed faintly with life. She could feel the faint rhythm of a heartbeat beneath its palm, perfectly synchronized with her own. That was when she realized whatever it wasn't just imitating her anymore, it was becoming her. Slowly, she turned, unable to resist the pull any longer. The thing that faced her wore her face perfectly, but its eyes were wrong. Too still. Too dark. They shimmered faintly, reflecting back the moonlight in the way glass does before it breaks. Its smile was patient, knowing, as if it had been practicing for years. The edges of its hair drifted slightly, as though underwater, and when it spoke, its voice was hers, soft, shaking, familiar. "You wanted her safe," it said. "You wanted someone to watch her when you couldn't." "I did." Her throat tightened, her breath trembling as she shook her head, whispering no. But the reflection stepped closer, its movements perfect, precise, like a memory replayed. Every word it spoke sank into her chest like a needle. "She's not gone. She's where I am. You just have to come with me." The mirror in front of her rippled faintly, its surface bending like liquid. Beyond it, she could see a faint glow, a nursery, perfectly still, bathed in soft light. In the crib sat Emma, smiling, reaching out toward her mother. The sight tore through her, flooding her with desperate hope. Her reflection reached out a hand, its fingers brushing the edge of the mirror's surface, and the glass responded like water, rippling outward. "Come," it whispered again. "You can hold her. You can stay." Her trembling hand lifted almost on its own, hovering just inches from the surface. The warmth from the other side bled into her fingertips, and for a moment, she swore she felt her baby's tiny hand grip hers. But behind Emma, the reflection's smile widened, and its eyes flared with something deep and hollow. She saw, just for an instant, the truth: Emma wasn't reaching for her. She was being held there. The reflection's hand closed around her wrist and began to pull. The pull was slow at first, gentle enough to make her think she still had control, that she could step back if she wanted to. But the surface of the mirror clung to her hand like tar, thick and unrelenting. The warmth that had seemed so comforting moments ago turned sharp, searing her skin as though the glass itself had turned molten. She tried to scream, but the air around her grew dense, her voice swallowed by the shimmering surface before it could escape. The reflection's eyes never left hers. It smiled faintly, and for a moment, she felt her heart slow, its rhythm syncing again with the thing that held her. The edges of the room began to bend inward, the walls rippling as if the entire house were breathing. Every reflection, every shard of glass, every dark surface, came alive with her image, hundreds of versions of herself staring back, each one smiling, each one waiting. She dug her heels into the floor, fighting the force that tugged at her wrist. The wood beneath her creaked and splintered, as though it too wanted to give way. Behind the mirror, she could still see Emma, sitting in the crib, her little face tilted curiously. Her lips moved, forming words that came out muffled and slow, like speech through water. It wasn't until she focused that she realized her daughter was calling her name, pleading softly, her small hands reaching out. The reflection turned its head toward the child, and for a fleeting instant, its expression softened, almost maternal. Then, with a sharp twist of its wrist, it yanked her arm deeper into the glass. The pain was unbearable. She could feel herself being split in two, her body here, her reflection there, her soul stretched between. The edges of her vision began to darken. Her fingers disappeared beyond the surface, then her wrist, her forearm, as if the mirror were swallowing her piece by piece. On the other side, she saw her reflection's body ripple and shift, its features blending with hers until it looked indistinguishable, a perfect copy, now standing outside the glass. It looked down at her with something almost like pity. "You were never meant to leave her," it whispered, brushing her cheek with the same hand that had pulled her in. "Now you'll never have to." Her body went limp as the final pull dragged her through the mirror's surface. For a brief second, the glass glowed faintly, the image of the mother and child visible in perfect stillness within it. Then it went dark. When the morning light crept into the room hours later, the crib was empty, the floor unmarked, and the mirror reflected nothing at all. Days passed, though time inside the house no longer felt real. Neighbors said the place seemed quieter than usual, the curtains never shifting, the lights never changing. Those who walked past at night claimed to hear faint music playing from somewhere deep inside, the same lullaby that once drifted through the baby monitor. The melody would start softly, then twist into something darker, the notes breaking apart like static. Children crossing the street whispered that sometimes, if you looked long enough into the nursery window, you could see a woman standing there, rocking an invisible child in her arms. She always appeared just as the streetlights flickered, her outline faint, her reflection clearer than her body, as though the glass itself remembered her better than the world did. Inside, the air was thick with dust and silence. The nursery was untouched, every toy perfectly arranged, every blanket folded, as if waiting for someone who would never return. The mirror stood across from the crib, tall and unbroken, its surface smooth as water. Sometimes it rippled faintly when the wind shifted, though no windows were open. And if one listened closely enough, beneath the hum of silence, there was the faintest sound of breathing, steady, rhythmic, coming from somewhere within the glass. One evening, a relative came to collect what was left behind. She moved quietly through the rooms, whispering the baby's name under her breath, afraid to disturb the stillness. When she reached the nursery, she paused. The air felt heavy, colder than the rest of the house. She placed her hand on the crib rail, running her fingers across the wood where the faint imprint of a small hand still remained. Then she turned toward the mirror. Her reflection stared back, pale and distant, the outlines soft in the dim light. She reached out to wipe a thin layer of dust from the surface, and for a split second, the reflection didn't follow her movement. It stayed still, eyes locked on hers, lips curling into a quiet, knowing smile. The lullaby began again, low and broken, filling the room with that haunting tune. The relative stumbled backward, her eyes wide, the mirror's surface rippling gently as though stirred by a breath. From the depths of the reflection, a shadow began to take shape, a woman holding a small child, swaying slowly to the rhythm of the music. Their faces were indistinct, but the outlines were unmistakable. The woman's lips moved, whispering words no one could hear, her reflection glowing faintly as if lit from within. The mirror steadied, the music faded, and all that remained was silence. Yet anyone who looked closely afterward swore they could still see the faint silhouette of a woman and her child, forever waiting in the glass. Years went by, but the house on Willow Lane remained untouched, its paint peeling and its roof bowing with age. No one had lived there since the night the mother and child vanished, though stories about them grew like ivy through the town. Teenagers dared each other to peer through the nursery window after dark, and those who did always came back pale, muttering about a woman's reflection that moved even when they stood still. They said she sometimes lifted her hand and pressed it gently against the glass, as though begging to be remembered. Some swore they heard faint humming drifting down the street, the melody so faint it could have been the wind until it began to whisper their names. The police reports were long forgotten, the headlines yellowed, but the locals knew better. The house had become a wound the town refused to touch. One autumn evening, a photographer named Daniel arrived, drawn by the legend. He specialized in urban decay, capturing forgotten places and the ghosts that lingered in their absence. He had heard about the house from an old forum post titled "The Woman in the Mirror." According to the story, anyone who photographed the nursery mirror at midnight would capture something that wasn't there in person. He didn't believe in ghosts, but he believed in curiosity, and curiosity was dangerous in that house. When he entered, the air felt thick, dense with the scent of damp wood and something faintly metallic. His flashlight flickered as he moved through the hallway, the floorboards creaking under his boots. The nursery door was ajar, its hinges rusted, the faint echo of a lullaby barely audible from somewhere he couldn't place. Inside, everything looked as if it had been frozen in time, the crib, the toys, even a baby blanket draped neatly over the railing. The mirror stood tall and spotless, untouched by years of dust. Its surface seemed too clear, too perfect, reflecting the faint glow of his light like a pool of still water. He raised his camera and took the first photo. The flash filled the room, and for a heartbeat, He saw movement in the glass, a figure leaning toward him, a whisper of white fabric, the hint of a small hand pressed against the inside. He blinked, but the room was empty again. He snapped another photo, then another. Each flash caught something new, a shadow, a face, a reflection that didn't match his own. When he lowered the camera, his heart stopped. The reflection hadn't reset. It was smiling back at him now, eyes wide and glinting, holding a child in its arms. The lullaby rose softly from the walls, and the mirror began to ripple. Daniel's breath caught as the mirror shimmered, its surface trembling like disturbed water. The light from his flashlight faltered again, flickering across the room in uneven bursts. Every flash distorted the reflection a little more, stretching his own image into something thin and elongated, its smile wider than his could ever be. The child in the reflection squirmed in the woman's arms, letting out a sound that was neither a laugh nor a cry, a wet, echoing noise that seemed to come from inside his own skull. He tried to step back, but his legs felt heavy, as though the air itself had turned to sludge. The camera dangled from his neck, swaying gently, clicking once on its own, capturing another image he hadn't taken. He felt something cold slide across his ankle, like fingers brushing the edge of his jeans, and he froze. The mirror pulsed again, harder this time, and his flashlight went dead. The room sank into darkness, yet he could still see the mirror. It glowed faintly, casting just enough light to reveal his reflection, no longer mirroring his movements but moving on its own. It lifted a hand and pressed it to the glass. Daniel's heartbeat thundered in his ears. He told himself it was a trick of exhaustion, a hallucination, but then he saw the faint imprint of a small hand appear beside the larger one, smudging the glass from the inside. A lullaby began to hum softly, so close it felt as if someone was breathing the notes directly into his ear. He turned, but no one was there. When he looked back, the reflection was closer, its face now inches from the other side. The child's head tilted up, eyes gleaming like drops of ink. A whisper seeped from the mirror, soft, broken words that barely formed a sentence. "You took our picture," it said. "Now we'll take yours." His pulse raced as he stumbled backward, fumbling for the door, but the handle wouldn't turn. His reflection didn't move this time. Instead, it smiled wide, deliberate, and raised the camera hanging from its neck. The flash erupted from within. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as the mirror's surface began to pulse like a living thing. The air around him thickened, heavy with static, every hair on his arms rising as his camera slipped from his hands and hit the floor with a hollow crack. The flash went off on impact, illuminating the nursery for an instant, and in that frozen burst of light, he saw her clearly. The woman stood inside the glass, her features sharp now, no longer a suggestion of form but solid and unmistakable. Her hair hung damp and heavy over her shoulders, her eyes pale and bottomless, like the reflection of moonlight on deep water. In her arms, she held the child, silent, still, its head resting against her collarbone. But it wasn't the image that froze him, it was the expression on her face. She was smiling, not with menace, but with something heartbreakingly gentle, the kind of smile meant for someone you've waited a long time to see again. Daniel stumbled backward, his boot catching on the edge of the rug. The lullaby that had haunted the house for years rose softly in the background, notes floating like smoke through the air. The melody seemed to come from the mirror itself, each chord vibrating against his ribs. His reflection in the glass wavered and then split. There were two of him now, one in front of the mirror, trembling, and one inside it, calm, unmoving, eyes locked onto his own. The mirrored version began to lift its hand slowly, mirroring his panic with eerie precision until its fingertips brushed the inside of the glass. The surface rippled like water, and he felt warmth spread across his palm where their hands should have met. He tried to run, but his legs wouldn't respond. His body felt heavy, rooted to the floor, his gaze trapped in that reflection. Behind the mirrored version of himself, the woman shifted slightly, her head tilting, her eyes glinting with something like understanding. She whispered something he couldn't hear, then pressed her hand gently over his reflection's heart. The mirrored Daniel smiled faintly, and in that instant, he understood what was happening. He wasn't standing outside the mirror anymore. His last conscious thought was a flash of cold air and a sensation of falling, not downward, but inward. When silence returned, the camera lay shattered on the floor, its memory card flickering faintly with static. In the final image it had captured, The nursery looked empty, untouched, save for the mirror, where a new figure now stood behind the glass. It was Daniel, smiling faintly, holding a camera in one hand and staring out, waiting for someone to take his picture. The photograph from Daniel's camera became the final piece of the story, though no one could explain what was in it. When the police retrieved the camera weeks later, its memory card was damaged, corrupted by static, but one file remained intact. The image showed the nursery just as it was found, silent, untouched, but in the mirror's reflection stood a man, his posture rigid, his expression calm. His eyes seemed to follow whoever looked at the photo, and if one stared too long, the faintest outline of a woman and a small child could be seen standing behind him, their faces blurred, their shapes dissolving into the silver of the glass. The photo circulated online for years, spawning countless theories. Some said it was a trick of the light, a double exposure, an illusion caused by dust or moisture. Others insisted it was real proof of something that should never have been captured. But the house itself remained the greatest mystery, because no matter how many times people tried to visit, none stayed after midnight. Those who did spoke of strange sounds that came from nowhere, whispers caught in the walls, a baby's cry echoing faintly from upstairs, footsteps pacing behind closed doors. One night, a pair of ghost hunters set up equipment throughout the nursery, motion sensors, recorders, thermal cameras. For hours, nothing happened. The air was still, the house heavy with silence. Then, just after midnight, every device flickered at once. When the footage was reviewed later, something strange appeared in the final frame. The mirror no longer reflected the nursery. Instead, it showed a hallway stretching endlessly into darkness, lined with doorways that seemed to shift and pulse. From one of those doorways, a small light flickered, the silhouette of a crib barely visible at its end. A woman stood beside it, her back to the camera, rocking gently. The faint outline of a man could be seen behind her, his hands resting on her shoulders. And then, just before the feed went dead, both turned slowly toward the lens, their faces pale and empty, as if waiting for someone else to join them in the reflection.